Okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody to our May Zoom. We have them now monthly. And just to let you know that our next Zoom in June is June 19th at 2 o'clock. And it's Dalloway Day. It's going to be hosted by Hatchards. In fact, Sarah and I are going to be physically in the bookshop, which is very exciting. And as well as the Woolf Studies people like Karina Jakubowicz and myself, we have Kathy Galvin, the poet, and the wonderful Elif Shafak, which is great. And so you need to go on to Eventbrite to register for that. It's free, but you have to be on Eventbrite. And our July Zoom is Nuala Hancock, who is here today, who's very kindly agreed to talk about Virginia Woolf and Gardens. And that is that's July 28th at 5:30. So Americans can get to us easily. We try and hold them at those times. So just before we start, just the household things of, not keeping your audio off, that this is being recorded. So if you really don't want your face to be seen, obviously you just have to switch off your video. And we'll use clips on social media, probably, very short clips afterwards. So thank you for that. Well, I'm going to introduce Mark, who will then do a short reading because, as I say, the book hasn't come out in America yet, so our American colleagues haven't had a chance to read it. And then I've got some questions and discussion with Mark for about 40 minutes. And then I'll open up to members. So anything you want to ask, any questions you want to ask, towards the end of my discussion with Mark, and not now, if you could put them in the chat so that I don't lose sight of them and they disappear from the screen, that would be great. Thank you. So Mark obviously needs no introduction. He's a major figure in Woolf Studies, editor of the Woolf Studies Annual until very recently, and made this wonderful CD-ROM, which very sadly, although I kept Windows 7 for years on an old machine, mine doesn't work now. But of course, Mark does have the Virginia Woolf A to Z, which everybody should have. And Mark is also still editing the Harcourt editions of Virginia Woolf, and he's on the editorial board of Cambridge University, Virginia Woolf. So welcome, Mark, and if you could read, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, this is about 6.5 minutes. I hope that's okay. Maggie and I discussed it, and I'm just going to read the preface, which for those of you who don't have the book will give it a kind of frame. Millions of people every year walk through the main entrance and up the grand staircase of London's National Gallery, just off Trafalgar Square. But few pause to identify the figures in the floor mosaics that decorate the vestibules and halfway landing. If they did, some might recognize the ballerina Margot Fonteyn, portraying delectation. Many might see that Winston Churchill represents defiance, and some would know that it is Virginia Woolf on whom the mosaicist Boris Anrep modeled Cleo, the muse of history. But how many could identify the figure of Bacchus as Clive Bell, Woolf's brother-in-law, and in his lifetime, an internationally known and respected writer on art? Even an avid reader of the hundreds of articles and biographies about the Bloomsbury Group knows Bell only as a sort of stock character, a red-faced bon vivant who escaped his provincial hunting, shooting, and fishing upbringing in a nouveau riche Wiltshire mansion by going up to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he met Toby Stephen, Leonard Woolf, and Lytton Strachey. Such a reader might also know that he later discovered the cafe life of artists and writers in Paris at the turn of the century, which prepared him to respond positively when Roger Fry invited him to assist in mounting an exhibition of post-impressionist painting in London in 1910. For decades, Clive Bell has been refracted through the voluminous commentary on Bloomsbury, leaving a distorted and incomplete image of him that this biography replaces with a more accurate view. Clearing away the accumulated layers of received opinion, this is a work of archaeology. digging down to reveal the tesserae that constitute the mosaic of a life more complex, more nuanced, and more sympathetic than that ossified in Lytton Strachey's witty barbs or Woolf's arch mockery. Although I don't avoid those aspects of Bell's character and behavior that might cause a reader to cringe, I also correct inaccuracies, such as the claim by a recent biographer that Woolf, quote, always disliked and distrusted Bell. Clive Bell's groundbreaking book, Art, remained in print for 50 years. Brazenly bending the narratives of art history to his purpose, Bell offered baffled English viewers of works by Gauguin, Van Gogh, Picasso, and Matisse a way to place them in the tradition which those artists were mistakenly thought to have rejected. When the painters were called insane, Bolsheviks, or charlatans, Bell was on the barricades defending them, thereby earning grateful letters throughout his life from young artists and writers for the courage his words had given them to follow their own vision of what art could be. His credo was individual freedom, whether that meant the freedom to make art as one saw fit, to make love to whom one wanted, or to say no when the government demanded that one sacrifice one's life for a cause that seemed to be a lie. Before and during the First World War, Bell was a bravely outspoken pacifist, a conviction he grimly held on to despite the tyrannies of the 1930s and a very different global conflict. For Bell, a society's response to unfamiliar art offered eloquent testimony of its broader views on liberty. In addition to his writings on art, Bell spent his life resisting what he characterized as, quote, the steady transformation of Puritan prejudice into middle-class opinion. A schoolboy when the British establishment crushed the rebellious spirit of Oscar Wilde in 1895, Bell lived his life in the service of a Wildean creed of sexual and personal freedom and disdained the notion that art must serve any purpose other than an aesthetic one. Bell was a faithful evangelist for modern art, prescient in his emphasis on the collaborative nature of perception and scathing about the habit of the wealthy to acquire works of art not because they like them, but because they bestow prestige. He was thoroughly cosmopolitan and therefore suspect in the opinion of those who adhere to that persistent deep strain of antipathy in England towards anything from across the Channel. His friends often remarked that what was most memorable about being in Bell's company was his conversation, but any traces of it which remain in letters or diaries are now so faded as to be hardly visible. As Virginia Woolf wrote, even the most interesting and important talk is as elusive as smoke. This biography depends entirely upon an incomplete written record, and who can say what has been lost in the course of more than a century that witnessed the two most destructive wars in all of human history. Bell seems to have kept every note, card, or letter he ever received, but those he sent to others have not often found such dogged hoarders. I have refrained from speculation or invention and tried to strike a reasonable balance between Hilary Spurling's admonition to biographers to leave no stone unturned and above all to turn stones over where no one has looked before, and Henry James's acknowledgement that relations stop nowhere and the exquisite problem of the artist is eternally but to draw the circle within which they shall happily appear to do so. Unlike many of his celebrated peers, Clive Bell left no reflections on his own life. Even in Old Friends, the memoir he created largely by reprinting articles he had written about other people, he's most visible as an expansive host, a gregarious pleasure seeker, whose greatest enjoyment derived from sharing with others his loves, his company, his table, his tastes, and above all, what he felt when he looked at a Cézanne, a Picasso, an early Derain, a Passmore, a Hitchens, or a Grant. A year after Bell's death, the critic Herbert Reed wrote a suitable epitaph. I prefer to remember him as an officer in the kingdom of the mind, not caring too much for discipline, encouraging insubordination, eager to share his riches with anyone who would knock at his door. Like Kant, Bell believed that the potential for responding to art with a peculiar emotion is an important aspect of what makes us human. He was the right man in the right place at a momentous time in the history of art. And this biography allows Bell to step out of the shadow cast by Bloomsbury, although it also acknowledges that, as Christopher Reid has explained, the group continues to stand for something that threatens established beliefs, and Clive Bell was very much part of that.
Great, thank you, Mark. That's really good. And we're going to now kind of unpick some of the tesserae. That's a lovely word you used. So just in terms of the research and the format, you talk about Roy Howard, the biographer of Keynes, and you say that a biographer is a Frankenstein, assembling materials from whatever parts are available. And your biography is amazingly smooth. It's amazingly seamless. So I just wanted to hear, first of all, how you organize that. The format is chronological, but some chapter headings are the people he knew well, like Virginia. And just say a bit about your huge research and what you discarded, maybe what you didn't put in.
In a way, those are two separate questions. One is the matter, and the other is the organization of it. And I think that one of the things that has always irritated me about biography is when I get to a phrase like "he must have," or "she certainly," and I think, well, maybe, but maybe not. So I was trying not to do that. But once I started the research, I fairly quickly ran into what I understand to be Virginia Woolf's problem with Roger Fry, because before I started work, I had these, visions of a really cool avant-garde new biography. But then I realized chronology is essential. And as I went on, I particularly came to understand that because Bell does not have a biography, that I ended up thinking of it as sort of prolegomena to a biography of Clive Bell, because I thought someone else might pick up pieces of this and take them somewhere. But every time I started to do that myself, I thought, no, just tell them what's happening. So, I mean, in practical terms, my research just began with going through everything I have to focus on Clive Bell, like my own library, and making a big index. And then, then I identified where I would need to travel. And luckily, at some point, before I got there, realized that much of what is at Sussex are photocopies of what's at King's. So I had these plans of, a week in Cambridge, then I've got to Sussex for a week, and then I thought, oh no, I can do it all in one place. And I did actually most of it in Sussex, because that's another story, but they make copying very easy. So I had to just read as much as I could. And it was, I think of it very much in practical terms. At the time, and this was a running sort of argument that I had with Patricia Maguire at King's, they did not allow any photography or scanning, or, you could order a scan. But when I've worked in archives before, it's been for a very specific purpose, and I'm looking for particular things. But I realized that, of course, I couldn't let anything go. And as I said in the preface, Clive Bell kept literally everything he received. I mean, I found little scraps of paper from Francis Partridge that says, came by the hotel, but you weren't there. See you at lunch, and when we were at the expo in Barcelona. So, and then another thing that was challenging at first was, obviously I had a fairly good understanding of the immediate Bloomsbury world and a little bit about the art world, but the wider circles, I didn't really know what might turn out to be significant and what may not lead anywhere. But I couldn't afford to not make notes on everything. And most of the research I did in Cambridge was just me typing furiously. Now, of course, they allow photography now that I'm done. In terms of the structure, luckily, I have come to recognize in myself the stages of my writing process. And one of the early stages is, why the hell did I ever say I would do this? And then another stage is, it's impossible. I have to just say, no, I can't do it. But I've learned now that that's just what I do. But I went through a lot of really difficult days just sitting with I tend to write in longhand when I'm starting something complicated. But I structure things sort of in a physical way, like I draw boxes and lines and maps. And that was the most challenging thing, which was to keep the narrative chronological, but to also allow for, and I'm just so happy that you said it's seamless, because that was the thing that I found most difficult, was to try and create a structure where one thing would lead without too much friction to the next. And that began with a lot of sort of internal screaming, but also just drawing, names and boxes, and like, it's also very difficult because when you introduce someone, you have to, I think, say who they are in a biography. You can't just have a name. You can't just sort of say Mary Hutchinson. You have to say, but then of course, at the same time, you can't go off on a mini biography of every person you introduce. So that was a challenge. So there'd be times when I'd be reading a draft and I'd read a name and I'd think, oh, well, I haven't said anything about that person. Now I'm just going on as if the reader will know. So I had to sort of retrace my steps. In terms of what I left out, I would say the two things that sort of really stuck in my mind as regrets in a way was, I wish that I'd been able to work in more about Frankie Birrell, because I think Clive was very fond of him, and through Raymond Mortimer they were quite close, but it just didn't work structurally. And also I think I probably should have written more about Walter Sickert in terms of his importance to them in the early days. But there were certain things where I just had to make a selection for the sake of the structure.
Well, you made a brilliant selection, I have to say, and there's an awful lot in it. I mean, I learned so much, and I just want to pick up on that earlier point you made about psychologizing the subject, because what I actually really liked was the way you didn't seem to fall in love with Clive. You're quite witty about him and sarcastic at times. And I love this point. This is more for Americans who haven't read it yet, but you say that Clive may have read Karen Stevens' sexology books, but he preferred empirical research. So there are these lovely little comments all the way through, which keep us involved. So are you still a bit ambiguous about Clive? How do you feel about him?
I don't know that I'm any more ambiguous about Clive than I am about anybody. I mean, that's also something I felt. Anyone who read, and there weren't that many people who agreed to read. I mean, not that I asked people who wouldn't do it, but I realized it was quite an imposition to ask people to read, drafts of something so big. But those who did almost always said, "Oh, but what do you think?" Say, everything. And I just kept saying, it's not about me. It's a biography. It's not, it doesn't matter what I think. So I tried very much not to psychologize him, although there were many times when I, felt I could easily have done so. And I think that he was a complex person. One thing that did make me wonder about his reputation was how many people that I do admire and have come to like Virginia Woolf, for example, really cared about him and really, had a deep relationship with him. And definitely there were elements of his character that were abhorrent, but then so were many other people. I mean, not that excuses it, but I think he was a genuinely kind person. I think he was very thoughtful. I think he cared about, well, he obviously cared about his friends deeply, but I think he also was someone who respected, I think, for example, his treatment of women. This is something I spoke to Henrietta Garnett early on, which I was so fortunate to be able to meet with her a few times. And we talked about that. And this is something actually that my mother had said to me when she saw some photos. She said, "How did he have all these affairs? He really wasn't very good looking." And I said that to Henry, and she said, he was just listened to me. He was very charming. He really took women seriously. He listened to them. So I kind of ended up, I shouldn't really say I have a feeling about him one way or another. He was just a subject. And I think probably, would have found him a sort of horrible upper class, snob. And but on the other hand, he's very funny. And he's one of those people where, in a social setting, people sort of roll their eyes at him, and yet he's the life of the party. And,
Yeah.
and so there's a sort of ambivalence about him, I still feel, I think.
Yeah. Well, I should start with Woolf because we're a Woolf society, and she comes out really well from the biography. I hadn't realized that she'd had so many reviews published by 1907. And you say, while Clive was dithering around, although he had all these Cambridge connections. But I was really intrigued by your choice of word for their relationship, which we know about after Julian's death. Julian's birth, sorry. And you say Clive manipulated Virginia, which I thought was an interesting choice of words. So I wondered if you'd say a bit more about that.
I think that he knew that calling her genius flattered her and attracted her. And I mean, certainly other people, particularly Jane Dunn, have written about the triangle between Vanessa, Virginia, and Clive.
Yeah.
I think that he played on the sense of that Clive had of being sort of abandoned by Vanessa because she had a baby, and that they took delight in talking about how terrible babies are, and you know, all they do is scream and puke. And but I think that was, when I say he manipulated Virginia, I think it was and I say at one point that he was cruel to Vanessa in that he had no regard for how she might feel about the relationship he was developing with Virginia when they would sort of go off on these long walks in Cornwall together. And I think, like so many of those young men, he was smitten with the sisters at Cambridge when he first saw them, just like Leonard was. I mean, and it became almost sort of difficult. It was those two were almost a unit. And I think that he couldn't bear to not have an intense emotional attachment to both of them. And I can't remember who it is. I think maybe Walter Lamb or someone says how absurd it is that Clive is behaving in this way, as if he's married to both of them. And, you know, he didn't make a secret of it. But I also think that he manipulated Virginia Woolf in the sense that he took her mental instability, not unseriously, but he sort of would make light of it. And in a way that many of them did in that circle, I think. It's like, who is it? It's in one of those films, Angelica Garnett talks about how they would say, oh, the goat, she's mad again. And I think Clive had that sensibility also, that he could push her into a kind of mania that was entertaining in a way, although of course it was very damaging in other ways. So, and that's an aspect of his character that certainly, you know, not very attractive.
Well, you make, I wondered if you're making an exception for Virginia, because I reread Art for today, because it's so long since I've read it. And I was actually so much more impressed by it this time. But in Art, he says, literature is never pure art. Very little of literature is a pure expression of emotion. And I wondered if you thought Clive might think Virginia an exception to that.
Yes, I think, I mean, there's that line in Old Friends where he says he's known many, many very clever and talented people, but he's only known two geniuses, Picasso and Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
And I think he saw that she was an extraordinary creative person very early on. And I mean, going back to an earlier question, that's something also that struck me, was that out of all the people she could have shared the drafts of what became The Voyage Out with, she sent them to Clive, and they engaged quite seriously. And that impressed me in a way that, you know, she was someone who took his criticism seriously. I mean, she rejected a lot of it, but I do think that he saw her as an exceptional writer of fiction, and had insights into her work early on, you know, what she was doing.
Yeah, you make that beautifully clear. I really, really like that. And the other person who comes out really well, of course, is Vanessa. I mean, she's heroic in biography. She arranges places for his mistresses and him to have assignations at Gordon Square, and obviously Charleston and Cassis as well. And again, when I was reading Art, I hadn't really read the preface before. I must have skipped it. And Clive says that he is in debt to his wife because she's been good enough to read both the manuscript and proof of the book. She's corrected some errors and called attention to the most glaring of offences against Christian charity. And rereading Art, I could hear Vanessa more, not as much as Fry, but certainly hear her voice, because Clive says to appreciate a work of art, we need bring nothing with us but a sense of form and colour and 3D space, which is what Vanessa says in her Leighton Park lecture that she gave. So I wondered how much Clive learned from Vanessa as a practicing artist, which he was not.
No, he wasn't. And he also, I think, although he did actually make some paintings, but I didn't include those. But he had a sort of fastidious dislike of, the mess of the studio. I think he didn't like to walk into the studio in his spats and get paint on them. But I can't remember how much of this I put in the book, but it's in the essay in the Bloomsbury Handbook, which I wrote about significant form. Yeah. And I think that there's a moment where Clive publishes his 1913 essay in Burlington, which is sort of a preview of what becomes art. He's working on art. And they are all together, I think at Asham, and arguing about aesthetics. And there's Leonard has written a very critical letter about, taking issue with this idea that you don't have to bring anything and that it's just an aesthetic experience. And Vanessa more or less says, oh, well, Duncan and I agree with Clive that when I look at a painting, what I see is form, I see color. Maybe later I will see that's a lake, that's a tree, but that's not what strikes me first. Whereas Leonard says that's impossible. You're first going to look for the corresponding shapes in the natural world, or some kind of figure. So I think I don't know enough to say whether Clive learned specifically from Vanessa, but what I do think is it's, and this is of course the great missing element, is the conversations that would have just gone on and on and on, which often made people like Lytton feel very on the outside, like they're going on about art. And I think one of Vanessa's early letters to Clive is like, hope you won't mind, but the great subject will be talked about when you get here, and that they're always talking about these new ideas. And so I think Clive, my take on it would be that he found a kind of confidence in articulating his ideas because Vanessa and Duncan Grant agreed and understood what he was saying and endorsed it to a certain extent. That this idea that art was not to be read as a narrative or anecdote or commentary on society, but was actually something that you engage with purely aesthetically. I mean, he did change his mind a little bit later in the 30s, or he refined his ideas. But I mean, as you know, there's very little of Vanessa Bell speaking about her art. I mean, she doesn't really theorize very much. In fact, I was just looking, there's a letter very early on to Duncan where he sent her some oranges and lemons, and she says something like, "It's so clever of you to leave them attached to the branch." And I immediately stuck them into an Italian pot, and against all theory, she's painting them sort of a representative, and there's a sort of this inside joke that I know we're not supposed to do that these days. But so I would say that he learned from Vanessa through talking about art, and found some confidence in those discussions, which gave him, and there's evidence for that in that he, for example, there's a letter he writes to Molly McCarthy where he says, "I don't really care what people like Leonard or Lytton say, because other people that I respect sort of outside the Bloomsbury circle have told me that my ideas are sound, and that's what sort of gives me the courage to go on."
Well, as you say, it's intensely popular, so that is evidence, I guess. But I mean, what's really impressive in the biography, and again, for people who haven't yet had a chance to read it, is just the range of Clive's interests and his ideas. I hadn't realized that he took 40 working men up to Cambridge after teaching at Working Men's College, which of course reminded me of Virginia Woolf teaching at Morley. Yeah. And then there's not very much mention of Clive in that early edited book you did of Virginia Woolf and War. So that's why this biography is so important, because Clive's support for conscience is just heroic, really. And he also presages Virginia's 3 guineas with his On British Freedom, you say, in 1923. You say, Clive says that the man who hits his wife and tortures his children last Saturday is as much a tyrant as a political leader, which is pure three guineas. So I was just a bit surprised when later on he calls Virginia's feminism tantrums. It was kind of an odd choice. Was he a feminist? Or did he find Virginia's feminism particularly upsetting?
I don't think that he found it particularly upsetting. And you mentioned that, and so I found it and realized I hadn't looked at it for the book, but it's in that BBC talk that he did in the 50s for that series where various people reminisced about Virginia Woolf. Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, there's a passage. I think this is where we had an exchange on Instagram, where in Civilization, where he writes about how until women are earning the same, for doing housework as barristers earn, you can't really say there's freedom or equality. And I was like, wow, it's like Clive, Wages for Housework campaign. I think he was very sensitive to the difference that gendered lives made to women's. He was really annoyed if, for example, if Vanessa seemed to be not painting because she had to do domestic things, and he said, that's what servants are for. Like, people like you and Duncan, he says at one point, should just paint. And he when Mary Hutchinson is suffering after giving birth to one of her children, he says, for God's sake, get help. So I think the question of his feminism is it's not really something I considered, because he's, I couldn't make a case for that. But I think that seems to me somewhat anomalous, the word tantrums. But it reminds me of what a lot of men in her circle also felt like, E.M. Forster talking about her work being spoiled by spots of feminism, or was it Maynard Keynes and disparaging 3 guineas. And that, that Roger Poole wrote that essay, We All Put Up With You, Virginia, that Lydia says as they're leaving. Whereas, Clive was very much in sync with her thinking on war. I noticed that he was sort of overtly misogynist in some of his letters to Strachey, and it was almost like he had developed this persona for Lytton. He was sort of playing up to it. But in terms of his personal relationships with women, he I think is very, I don't want to say respectful, but he treats women as equals. He treats them on, he doesn't ever talk down to any of his correspondents, any of his lovers. So that I'd have to sort of think about that word tantrums in the context of the 1950s and giving a radio talk. Yeah. I'm not trying to dodge it. I have been thinking about it because I knew you were going to ask me, but it's it does seem to me sort of a bit of an anomaly, except that I wouldn't go so far as to say he was, a feminist. He was someone who recognized the way society was organized, and I think felt that anything that impinged on people's freedom in any way was bad and should be opposed.
Yeah, which is very Bloomsbury, of course, to be like that. Well, the other person who comes out really well is Duncan. Well, everybody likes Duncan, of course, so he's going to come out well. But Clive promoting him particularly as the sort of best English painter. And I was interested that you mentioned that Clive, like Lewis Hind, who is one of my favourite critics, because he very early on appreciated the Hudson Group. So I was wondering really what Clive might have learned from Duncan, because when I was researching at one time, I was reading Duncan's scrapbook in the Tate Archive, and Duncan kept all of Lewis Hind's newspaper articles that were the basis for the post-impressionist book. So I wondered if Clive had learnt from Duncan, not just from Roger Fry, as people talk about.
I think that I would say, kind of similarly to what I said about Vanessa, that Duncan was someone who was an artist who endorsed Clive's ideas and demonstrated them. One thing I would say probably that was perhaps more of a, maybe not a lesson, but sort of a bond between them, was their interest in and sense of the importance of Byzantine art. And the 5th century mosaics that had such a profound impact on Duncan and other artists too, particularly in the murals that he did with the bathers at the, where was it, the Technical College in London? I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, Borough Polytechnic, yeah.
But I think the Borough Polytechnic, right? The that sense that Duncan was sort of going his own way was something I think that helped Clive in, again, feeling a confidence in his ideas. I can't really say, I mean, this is an example where I didn't want to have an opinion. Clive just shamelessly goes on for years saying Duncan Grant is the best painter in England. And everyone else just paled by comparison. On and on and on. And of course, other people just find that ridiculous, or they get very upset by it. And but it didn't bother Clive. I think he believed it. I don't think he was doing it because he liked Duncan. I mean, I think he genuinely thought Duncan was a pioneer. And he does seem to have a sort of a blind spot, I think, about some of the variations of quality in Duncan's work. It's almost as if everything Duncan touches is brilliant. But I would say your question is sort of revealing a real, not so much a blind spot, but something that I didn't really consider, which was how much Clive learned from the painters in his own life, in a direct way. That actually, because he doesn't seem to be that interested in technique. When he writes, he always just writes about the painting that he's looking at. And he'll sometimes talk about brush strokes or balance or form or harmony, but he talks a lot about form, obviously, but he doesn't really do any sort of technical analysis ever, I think, or very, very rarely. In fact, if anything, he gets more technical about sculpture later on in the mid to late 20s. But I think, again, that Duncan was someone who, to him, was the embodiment of his theorizing, that art had taken this big detour through the Renaissance and was finally sort of coming to its senses in the late 19th century. And looking at the work of Duncan, he said, "This is what I mean."
Yeah, the Byzantine is really important. We've got a lovely video which we're going to put on our YouTube channel very soon from an art historian, Julie Trinkler-Burt, and she has a couple of particularly good images which show the influence of Byzantine on Duncan Grant, which we'll be putting up for members soon. Another point about Vanessa and Duncan is Clive likes Mauriac's book Impressionism, and I was absolutely shocked when I read it. when I was working on Vanessa's year 1904 to 5, to discover how anti-Semitic Mauriac was early on, not just obviously later on. He's explicitly anti-Semitic, but Clive doesn't seem to notice that either.
Do you mean Mauriac or Mauclair?
Mauclair, yes, the book that the Vichy government based the Vichy laws on. They both Clive and Vanessa read the Impressionists, and they don't make any mention of it. So I was quite surprised by that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, the other person who doesn't come out at all well is Leonard in terms of Clive. And I hadn't realised that. I mean, I knew about the caricature in the Wise Virgins, obviously, but he doesn't seem to come out terribly well in terms of his response to Clive. And I just wondered, why did that continue? I could understand it in the early days, but why did that continue?
I wouldn't say he doesn't come out well. I would just say that he obviously didn't. I was very fortunate early on. I was able to meet Olivia Bell when I was just beginning this. And I said to her, I get the impression that Leonard would not really have had much time for Clive if he hadn't been married to Vanessa. And she said, yes. I think they just rubbed each other the wrong way. And I think Leonard was very upset by the flirtation that, I mean, Clive was terrible when Leonard is courting Virginia. He comes back from his post and Clive is in Italy and sort of trying to find out, has he proposed, and just writing scurrilously to Molly McCarthy about Leonard and Virginia, and like how, basically saying no one would be a good enough husband except me for Virginia. And later on, I mean, he irritates Clive by making light of Virginia's mental state, by making these sort of flippant remarks about how he's going to drive her mad and what fun that will be, and keeps talking about her as a kind of object of his desire. And I think Clive's flippancy and what Lytton calls his Cliviness probably irritated Leonard, who was a very serious person. And I think that Leonard just found Clive a bit of an ass. But I don't think that makes Leonard come out badly. I think they just, they also loved each other. I mean, this is something that really came across to me in reading so much of the Bloomsbury Group's correspondence, is that they really do have the characteristics of a family where I often will use this when I was teaching to students about, sort of these very cut and dried responses. And I will say, think about your own family, like the most intense emotions of anger and love that you feel can be about the same person. And I feel like that in a way, there are these bonds between Leonard and Clive and Lytton that are sorely tested, but never near breaking. I mean, they might have periods of sort of being frosty, but I just think Leonard found Clive irritating, but as many people did, as Virginia Woolf did. But he was a relative.
Well, it's just that as once reading the biography, one's getting so involved with Clive that anyone who is antagonistic to Clive, you immediately begin to like less, because you're really batting for Clive all the way through, I felt anyway. I cried at the end.
I'm surprised, actually, because you seem to have really been taken by Clive.
Well, it's the biography. It's what you tell us about him. And I cried at the end when he died. You mentioned earlier about Clive and women, and of course Clive's mistresses figure very large in the book. I really had no idea about the huge number, and also that they were also attractive. Well, apart from Mary Hutchinson, I've never liked those eyebrows, so I never really found Mary Hutchinson very attractive. A bit like Wallace Simpson, really. But I love that you tell us that he gave each lover copies of Les Léos and Dangereuses and lettre inconnu to read, which I thought was extraordinary. But the thing I really hadn't realised was their significance to Clive's views, not just his sex life, and introducing him to the New York art scene. So that Clive was sort of ahead of the Bloomsbury Group at this time in terms of knowing about New York through one of his mistresses, whose name I've forgotten for the moment.
Yeah, Janice Lowe.
Yeah, and she's gorgeous too.
Yeah, she's the one who I really got distracted by, and in fact, I want to write more about her. She's fascinating. Janice Lowe was a recent graduate, about 23, and she was working for Christian Zervos in Paris, and Zervos is, doing the catalogue raisonné, and Picasso says, well, if you want to know about, I think it's like, people who bought my work in England before the war, Clive Bell's the person who'll know more than him. So she writes to him, dear Mr. Bell, on cahier letterhead, Picasso says, blah, 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 and if you could spare me some time to meet, that would be wonderful. And then there's another letter, and then there's a postcard that's Carissimo mio, and they're off to the south of France for dinner. And they had this affair. And Janice Lowe's life is very interesting in its own right. She was friends with Walker Evans and pretty much everyone in the New York art scene. She was very close to Daisy Barr, Alfred Barr's wife, who's her best friend. But she also, when she came to England, was quite well regarded by Virginia Woolf. She fitted into the Bloomsbury scene. She stayed on until the Second World War, and she was one of the early students at the Euston Road School. So she went with Quentin and Angelica to, she became very close to Claude Roberts and his wife, Elsie. But you asked me at the beginning things I left out, or even more girlfriends affairs that I left out, partly through sort of permissions exhaustion, like trying to track down what relative descendant I could find to get permission to quote something. But I think, that struck me about his relationship. I mean, Mary Hutchinson is the most serious relationship that he has in terms of a long term. They were on and off, but together for about 11 years. But all of the people with whom all the women with whom he had sexual relationships and intimate friendships, they continued to be friendly after the affair was over, and they are all women who are quite independent, sexually independent in the sense of being in control of their own lives, highly intelligent, and also people that he, early on, I discovered, and this is something in the beginning of the book, and I couldn't find out very much about her, but there's a lot of correspondence from a young woman who lived in Edinburgh called Louis Blakey. And she's a family friend, like her family and his family clearly know each other. And just before and during the time he's at Cambridge, there's only her side of the correspondence, which he kept. But they clearly were having very, very serious debates in the end of the 19th century, the first 3 or 4 years, about religion, she was a quite devout Christian, about Ibsen, about freedom, about Shelley, there's a kind of intellectual engagement which struck me because it's quite different from someone like Lytton Strachey, who often seems to just want an all-male atmosphere. And I can't remember the exact quote, but there's something about, I think it's Lytton in one of the early at home situations at the sort of origin of the Bloomsbury Group, where I think it's Lytton says something about, it was wonderful, except that, Toby's sisters were there, which made it a bit awkward. Clive never he seems to have relationships of equality with the women that he's involved with. And yes, he had a huge number of affairs. But as I always say to people who are disparaging about people who have affairs, it's like, there has to be someone you're having an affair with. It's not, and they are, as I said, a lot of them are very interesting in their own right, like Amber Blanco White, who is H.G. Wells' mistress, and Bertha Penrose, or the playwright whose name I'm forgetting now. Beatrice, I'd have to look in the book to remind me, who was a quite successful playwright, but I can't remember her last name. But yeah, I think that his attitude also was, you know, people often point out that Bloomsbury was not as free as it sort of is made out to be, or as it made itself out to be, that there was jealousy and tension and a certain regard for what, you know, outsiders would think. I mean, sometimes that was for practical reasons, like that being homosexual was against the law. But Clive sort of made a point of just being open, you know, wanted open relationships, and talks about, he doesn't insist on it if a woman he's having an affair with is married. He understands that she needs to keep it secret, but it's almost like, well, you know, that's your business. It's not how I would do things, but that's fine. But yeah, some of the women, I think, particularly Janice Loeb, who he met in 1937, really warrant like biographies of their own. And you mentioned his being exposed to the New York art scene. One of the things, of course, about Clive, which is great and also challenging, was that he lived until 1964. So, you know, unlike Roger and Lytton and Virginia, he has decades more life. And he did, yes, he went to New York in 1950, and he did this lecture tour, and then he went back in 1952. And one of my favorite images of him was he takes a train from Washington to Kansas City. And I just imagine him like a 17-hour train ride across the US. And that was something I mean, he was invited as a, you know, eminent old critic. And he complains to his host at one point that people aren't really interested in his ideas. They're only interested in the, you know, the great artists that he's known. And of course that was true. Like, he could tell anecdotes about Matisse and Picasso and so on, but that he did have an exposure to what was going on in the 50s through Janice Loeb, who continued to write to him. 1952 was the last time they ever met in person, but they continued to correspond. And she really was at the heart of what she called the art gang. And of course, in the 50s, some of you may have read that book, How New York Stole Modern Art. It's that is a very significant time in this country in terms of what was happening. Not that he liked it, and you know, he was pretty disparaging about, you know, de Kooning and Pollock, but he dutifully went around the Whitney annual exhibition of American art, and just, you know, he loved his experience of being in the States. He found people so generous, and everywhere he went, he was, you know, feted and given dinners, and people said nice things about him. And he also saw some old friends when he was in New York, like Mina Kirstein, Lincoln Kirstein's sister, who's another probably lover. Not quite sure. That was the thing. I had this debate with my managing editor about, in the index, it says something about affairs. And I said, well, I'm not sure you can call them all affairs. Like, how are you defining affair? But I had to let that go. Yes,
well, they kept him young, and also so that made for his impact on younger people, as you've just been saying. And you talk about his impact on the second generation, Brian Howard, Cyril Connolly, Harold Acton, who thought Clive a prophet. But also I was intrigued, came across a quote from Raymond Mortimer, who said that astonishingly, that Clive was an apostle of contemporary art, a poet, historian of civilization, and a psychological biographer. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about his impact, because we're always talking about Woolf's legacy. You know, I was on the radio talking about Woolf's legacy a while ago. So what is Clive's legacy, his impact?
One of the people who most surprised me was Colin McInnes, who wrote this fan letter, and it was just before the first of the London trilogy came out. And he writes a fan letter to Clive saying that, you know, sort of, without you, I couldn't be the person I am now, that you absolutely changed the way I thought about art, because he was an art critic, I think, for The Observer, before he became better known as a novelist. And that was quite typical of many letters from particularly young visual artists, like Ivan Hitchens wrote, and he didn't write to Clive, but he's being interviewed, I think, for a sort of oral history, or maybe it was for an exhibition at Tate in the 70s, and I think Alan Bowen is interviewing him, and Hitchens says, well, you know, I went through a fairly traditional art school, and I followed the norms that I was being taught, and then I read art, and suddenly, you know, the world opened up, and I couldn't think about art in the same way. And there are many, like, obscure, well, turned out not to be obscure. There's a wonderful couple of very long letters from a young New York artist called Hanania Harari, who I just read this letter, and it was, you know, dear Clive Bell, your work has meant so much to us. Me and my best friend Herzl are off to Israel to create a new world of art, and, you know, if we had our way, you would be the prime minister. And I just, because Google is such a wonderful tool now, I discovered, oh yeah, he actually became a fairly successful abstract painter, and, you know, has works in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then there's a second letter saying, oh, nothing worked out, and now I'm back in America where it's all dismal. But so things like, there were a couple of long letters from a coal miner in Wales who said that, you know, I wasn't able to go to university, but your books have been my university. I've read them all, and, you know, I've gone to the museums when I've the limited time I've had available. I've gone to London, I've gone to the V&A, and I've, you know, followed up what you've suggested. So I think he went on, you know, responding to, he would always write back to people, I mean, which I just know from subsequent letters where in the files, you know, it would be, thank you so much for replying. And I think, in a way, not on anything like the scale of Virginia Woolf, but I do think he was encouraging to young people. And I think his reputation, even though it's certainly not the reputation he has now, that he was seen as someone who was liberating at a time when, for young people in the, you know, teens and 20s, felt very constricted, and if they had new ideas, they didn't really get much encouragement. And there are also letters from, there's a letter from, I think his name is Stuart Preston, who became quite a well-known art critic, and he became close to Raymond Mortimer, but he writes in 1942, and he's an American sailor, and he says, I'm on an American warship sort of off the coast of England, and I want to just write and tell you how much your work has meant to me. And so it's sort of theme of thanking him for providing a way of thinking about culture. And also, I think, emphasize, and this is something I said in the preface, that, and this is something I do think is salient now, when we think about the way politicians attack art now, that, or particularly in this country, the way that Clive Bell sort of used that as a barometer of a society's liberty, that the tolerance for new forms of art, challenging forms of art, is a kind of indication of how liberated a society can be. And that rejection of the new, or, you know, the way the post-impressionists were treated as, this isn't art, lunatics could do this, children could do it. It's identical to how, I mean, if you just go to a museum and stand in a 20th century gallery, sooner or later someone will come and say, oh, my kid could do that, or I could do that. Yeah. And I usually say, go on then, you'd be very wealthy if you could actually do what Rothko's doing. Yeah.
Well, actually, standing in front of a Rothko, you don't really want to do it, really. Lisa's just pointed out, in agreement with you, that Georgia O'Keeffe used Clive Bell's art to write a lecture on modern art for a school in Canyon, Texas, which I didn't know. So that's interesting. And I'm just going to end. Yeah, I'm just going to end with a quickie, because people are now putting questions in the chat, and so we can just throw it open for the chat. I just love indexes. This is really nerdy, but I love the positioning of Maggie Thatcher next to the theatre of cruelty, and between that and Thackeray. I love these things. But just want to end with a very serious note, because I hadn't realised about the Trotter family. It's my own ignorance. And you thank them for letting you see the Bell family album and the letters and the diaries. And what are they going to do with them? Because those should be in a public place, especially in England, I would say. But,
well,
what are they going to do?
They're in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Graham Trotter's house.
Yeah.
And Graham's mother, Henrietta, was Clive's sister Dorothy's daughter. And her sister, I think, Selina, had she's the one surviving of 3 daughters. They have the family albums of the Bell parents, and they also have Dorothy Honey's diary and some letters from Henry Honey, who was Dorothy's husband. And Graham Trotter is very interested in his own family history. And I think that's what he's doing at the moment, is mining them for his own purposes. I think they're very generous. They know the value of what they have. I'm not sure I could certainly ask if they plan to do anything with them. They're not old, so I think they're not really thinking about that. But yeah, it was an amazing, and that was one of those wonderful serendipitous of several I had in the course of doing this. I was at Charleston, and Darren Clark just said, "Oh, some relative of Clive's was here the other day, and would you like their email address?" And I said, "Yes, please." And he said, "Oh, I'll dig it out for you." So it just happened to be at the time I was at Charleston going through Clive's library, and there were, I don't know, I may have come across them otherwise, but yeah, they were a wonderful find. And I don't, as I said, I don't know what they're doing. I'm just looking at the chat.
Yeah, we got a question from Sarah. She says, where do you think he considered his own home to be, and why?
I think he considered Charleston his home.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly after 1939 when he lived there permanently. That's, I think, an aspect of the sadness of his life, that he didn't really have a home of his own. Yeah. He was quite a nomad in a sense. I say in the book how he has this, which maybe is one of the things I related to, this feeling of sort of always being displaced, that he sort of feels English, but he really feels more at home in Paris, and he's constantly talking about how he should just settle in Paris, but that couldn't, and relies all through his life on Vanessa to be a domestic center. And there's a sort of almost a rhythm to his correspondence where he's in France and he's coming back, and he always writes to Vanessa and says, I'll be arriving at 3. Can you, who will be there to have dinner? Can we have a family dinner? Whoever's around. So Virginia, Leonard, Duncan, you, whoever's there, and that's sort of the center he comes back to. And I think Charleston also. I would say in answer to Sarah's question that Charleston is where he considered his home. He talks about Charleston as his home, and he corresponds from there. He does a lot of writing there. So And it was really, to a certain extent. And of course, his family money is behind a lot of it, as well as Kane's. But it was Clive's unearned income that, to some degree, funded that life.
Yeah. And Francis Partridge says, I got another quote that I didn't read before, that he was a great host and a great enjoyer, but also that Angelica says that he was more upset, betrayed more emotion when Vanessa died than anyone she'd ever seen, and anyone else that he had.
She'd ever seen, yes. I mean,
yeah.
It's they remained married. Their lives were very intertwined in terms of their finances, in terms of their relations with their sons, and certainly until Julian died. It's one of the things Henrietta Garnett said to me early on was, when Vanessa got pregnant with Angelica, and this is what Henrietta said, Clive could have said, I'm not going to be cuckolded by this queer artist. But he didn't. He went along with it. He took on the parental role for a while. So I think the complexity and ambivalence of family seems very powerful to me in this, not just Clive's story, but all of them, that there are these, the sense of them being a family with all that entails, its complexity. And I think that the loss of Vanessa really shattered Clive. And it was also he was ill himself. He was in a nursing home recovering when he was told that she died. And I think that also affected him. I think Frances Spalding in her biography of Vanessa talks about Clive, weeping for the woman he'd never stopped loving. And he deeply loved Vanessa always. And I think Clive was a bit intimidated by Vanessa too, because she had his measure, she could say anything to him.
Yeah. So Peter has quite a major question here. To what degree do you think anti-Semitism played a role in Leonard and Clive's relationships?
I do think it probably did have some bearing on the friction between them. And as Peter knows, there's this, that reference when Clive says to Lytton, you're showing my letters to that bloody Jew. And there's this, so that flippant calling of Leonard the Jew, but as Virginia did, as many of them did, it was, the way that he was, Susan Wegan has written so powerfully about this in the Bloomsbury Handbook to Bloomsbury, about that sort of pervasive anti-Semitism that can be sort of glossed over as though that's just the way people were. But of course, yes, that is just the way people were, that there was a very powerful current of anti-Semitism. And I think that it was something that Clive could use as a way of, in answer to Peter's question, sort of not one-upmanship, but a way of almost sort of putting Leonard in his place. Like Clive himself experienced that, I think, with some of the, class issues that he encountered being a provincial, coming to that metropolitan circle, as he called it. But I think he also could display that kind of antagonism to Leonard based on his Jewishness. And it was something that he used as a way of articulating why, he was not an appropriate choice for Virginia. So I can't say to what degree, but I think it certainly had a role in their relationship.
Yeah.
And yes, those are the letters of Samuel Beckett.
We've got time for a couple more questions, so I'll just focus on the ones that have got more in them. Daniel's worried about Virginia sending money to Angelica when Clive was quite well off. And why would she send Angelica money? Did Clive treat her differently than his sons? But actually, that's true of many people. Even my Settling, the film star that I worked on, she always sent her granddaughter money, but not her grandsons. I mean, I think it's more common. But did Clive treat her differently?
No, and in fact, one of the things that Olivia Bell said to me when we met was that in his will, Clive divided his estate equally between Quentin and Angelica, and she thought that was remarkable. She said to me, isn't that remarkable? And I said, yes. I mean, it was left, her share of it was put in trust for her children. But no, I think he treated her the same as his sons in terms of finances. Yeah. He helps her at some point, I think, when she's with Bunny, with some kind of investment in the publishing house. Clive gives her money for that.
Yeah. And Vara, Vara wants to know about the difficulty in accessing some of the materials. I know you've talked about that at Woolf conferences, but the process of acquiring the documents. And then you mentioned Clive submitted several drawings of birds. So what else did he create? Gosh. Well,
at Charleston, there are 3 paintings that Clive made. They're not very good. And they wanted too much money to get photographs of them. So he did paint at least 3 paintings. I think the drawings of birds were in the early days of the Friday Club. He had sent some. I don't think he was there when they were exhibited, but he was able to sketch, and like in the Tate, there's a great big sketchbook that he used as a notebook where he's just sort of doodling heads. So he seems proficient, but maybe lots of people were. I'm not sure. Vara asked when. Well, I started probably to envision this project around 2012. There's a sort of a backstory to this, to do with an art historian named James Beechey. Some of you may know his name. I'll just quickly tell how this began was that as I said in the acknowledgements, for a long time, like where I'm sitting, I can see all my Bloomsbury books. And every now and again, I would think, wow, there's that big fat Gerald Brennan biography. It's kind of odd that there's nothing on Clive. And then one day I just sort of Googled Clive Bell biography in case I'd missed something. And this book came up on Amazon, announced as forthcoming in 2019. And this was about 2011. And I thought, forthcoming in 2019 seems very strange, but it was coming out from Cape. So I have a friend in London who is in publishing. So I emailed her and said, do you know anyone at Cape? And she did, and wrote back and said, oh yes, the manuscript was never delivered. It was due in 2004. And I said, well, it's still on Amazon. And she said, well, that's impenetrable. So I thought at that point that maybe James Beechey was very old or died, but then I found out he's actually younger than I am. But that he'd not finished this book. So I started to just ask around, and I'm very fortunate that I know Francis Spalding and Andrew McNeely, and they encouraged me, and Francis introduced me to Olivia Bell because I felt like I couldn't just do it sort of out of the blue. So I met with her, and actually first I spoke to her on the phone, and she encouraged me, and then I started. I don't know that I had difficulty accessing materials, apart from the practical difficulty of getting funding to travel to places and stay because I was away a lot. I spent like weeks at a time in England because the main places I needed to go were Cambridge and Sussex. And then I spent a week in Texas at the for the Mary Hutchinson stuff. But I don't. People were phenomenal. I mean, so helpful. There's a woman who had bought a whole load of Clive's letters to Lytton Strachey, and she's a private collector. And I managed to discover who she was, and she said, "Oh, you're welcome to come and look at them in my house in California." And I said, "Well, I'm not planning to go to California." So, but then she said, "Oh, well, the British Library requires copies to be made because of the heritage concern." So she gave me, they were meant to be embargoed for 7 years, but she gave the library permission to let me look at them. So I actually had, you know, wonderful help along the way.
Great. There are two questions on art. I'll run them together if that's okay, Sarah and Andrea. But Sarah's just surprised when you talked about Clive not liking Cubism, because, you know, she remembers about Clive being excited with their first Picasso, or the very first Picasso in private collection in England. And then Andrea wants to know about, did Clive engage with German art, with the painters of the Brücke or the Blaureiter, like Kandinsky, Mag? Was there any of that?
Yeah, I think that I don't know that I would call that Picasso they bought Cubist, really.
No.
But in a way, that kind of is part of the answer. I think that Clive felt that Cubism, as it developed, I mean, what he wrote about was that it became almost a kind of mathematical exercise that people were artists. You know, one of the things he says often about Picasso is how Picasso creates this following and then moves on to something else, and other artists are sort of trying to do what Picasso is no longer doing. So we get all these sort of imitation Picassos. And I think he felt a bit like that about the later iterations of Cubism, that they were sort of cubists for the sake of being cubists rather than being actually what the painter was feeling should be done. He didn't really engage much with the Blaureiter artists, or he writes later, he writes a little about Kandinsky, but sort of in passing. I mean, the thing that really I think is important to bear in mind is that principally I would think of Clive as a journalist. I mean, he was really a sort of cultural critic. He wasn't really a theoretician of art. I mean, he makes his reputation with this early book art, but a lot of what he writes are the kinds of, you know, he writes for Vogue, he writes for the Nation, and a lot of what he's writing is sort of what's on this month in Paris or what's on in London. So it's this kind of middle brow, but intelligent and informed, but not necessarily very profound. And I think that when he writes about Klee or Kandinsky, it's more in that kind of context where he'll just say, oh, the kind of thing that Kandinsky's doing. There's something that's buzzing around in my head where he says about a painter would be better off not naming his works, you know, not giving actual names in the way that Kandinsky does. It's just, you know, number 1, number 2, number 3. And he does talk about Klee quite favorably. I mean, he does have very particular likes later on, or not so much like, but he's interested in, you know, Balthus, for example. He just finds him interesting. And the Russians, yeah, he didn't really have much to say about the Russians.
Well, Wendy, earlier on, Wendy had said that your book was brilliant, which I think we all agree with. So in fact, the last questions seem a good point at which to end the interview. Because you said earlier about Woolf's ideas about the aims of biography, because you were talking about Roger Fry, the biographer. But Kate goes on to say, will you ever write another biography again? And who would you like to see a biography of in the Bloomsbury group?
I hope I won't ever write one again. I have to say, I developed a real sort of antipathy to biography as a genre doing this. And I just felt, and I can see, when I read biographies now, I can see, oh yeah, I can see where you've cut that corner to make that smooth. And it's almost like, you know, tearing the walls of your house apart and seeing what it's actually like behind the scenes. So I mean, as I said earlier, the person who really captivated me was this young woman, Janice Lowe, who there's just so much about her that was fascinating. And I managed to track down her daughter, who lives in Utah, who very generously let me, well, she let me quote from the letters, but also didn't really, her mother was 45 when she was born, and she said she didn't really know much about her mother's early life. So what I was telling her was sort of revelatory to her. And I actually know a lot more probably that she doesn't know. So I would like to write something. I'm not sure if it's a full biography, but I'm gathering more information about Janice Lowe. Oh, and she married, her second husband was the brother of the photographer Helen Levitt, and Bill Levitt, her husband, Janice and Helen Levitt, the three of them formed one of the very earliest documentary film companies in New York in the 40s. And the first film they made was this short called In the Street, which was shot in Spanish Harlem. And then they made a film called The Quiet One with James Agee, it was about an unusually multi-ethnic home for, not really an orphanage, but a home for sort of abandoned children in upstate New York. And it was a sort of fictionalized, it was a documentary, but they wrote a script for it and centered it on this young Black boy who gives the title of the film, The Quiet One. So she's really, and she taught at the New School. During the war, she did research on German radio propaganda. It's just very interesting and knowledgeable. And then sort of abandoned that life of art. You know, she stopped painting and stopped writing about art. But so as far as in the larger Bloomsbury circle, I don't know who's left. Saxon Sidney Turner. But
yeah.
I think
Well, that seems
great.
That would be great. So I think this is a good point to leave it, that Mark's now going to write another biography, although he said he isn't. Thank you so much it's just been the most illuminating interview I think we've ever done. We're really grateful.